Hello, my name is Ryan Anderson. I am an ATP and a CFI for airplane, instrument, and multi-engine aircraft. In this video, I am going to discuss attitude flying and the most effective way to scan your instruments. There are a few different schools of thought on the instrument scan, and they all pretty much get the job done in slow, light aircraft. But some of these theories can literally get you killed once you move up into the faster, heavier hardware. When beginning with an instrument student, many flight schools go straight to covering up the attitude indicator and teach you how to fly using the primary instruments. The biggest argument that I have heard for this reasoning is that the ACS says that you should not have an undue reliance on the attitude indicator. I guess they figure that the thing dies so much that you cannot rely on it. What exactly is an undue reliance? That seems to be a relative term subject to interpretation. What I have found is that this method trains a pilot to not look at the attitude indicator, rather all of the proclaimed primary instruments. In all reality, with my 8,000 hours of flight time, I have only had an attitude indicator fail twice. One time the attitude indicator was slowly failing, but it still worked, although imprecisely. The other time was a vacuum failure, and that both the attitude indicator and the heading indicator failed together. My initial question to those who want to eliminate the attitude indicator is, if the thing is not important, why do they put it front and center right in front of the pilot? After all, Part 91 requires it for instrument flight. Many aircraft, including those flying Part 135 and 121, not only require the attitude on both sides of the instrument panel, but a standby indicator that can run on its own power for 30 minutes after a total system failure. The loss of an attitude indicator constitutes an emergency, and without one, you will be relegated to a no gyro approach. 121 aircraft have a 4-inch attitude indicator rather than a 3-inch, and glass cockpits overlay the entire screen with the attitude indicator. We do not want to eliminate the attitude indicator from our scan. Rather, we need to make it front and center as it was meant to be. Initially, I also was taught to pay more attention to my primary instruments. I trained in 2 aircraft while working on my instrument rating, a Cessna 152 and a 172. These airplanes are relatively light, and you typically do not shoot an approach at more than 90 knots. So initially, off the runway, you pitch up visually, get your airspeed for your best rate of climb, then put your hood on, and off you go on simulated instrument conditions. Reaction time for the airspeed is fairly fast, as are heading changes in a shallow bank. Problems arise when you move up into a much heavier, faster airplane. The heavy airplane takes much longer to speed up and to slow down than your training aircraft, and things tend to happen a whole lot faster. With the higher speeds, your standard rate of turn also requires a steeper bank for a turn, so your heading changes will be much slower at a given bank at higher airspeeds. What people seem to miss is that the attitude indicator may not be the primary instrument for pitch and bank, but it is and should be used as the primary instrument to enter all maneuvers, and should be your main focus during all phases of flight, then being backed up by your primary instruments. I have seen pilots from Part 141 flight schools with both 2- and 4-year degrees who struggled greatly when getting into a much heavier aircraft. Headings varied greatly, and their simulator work was anything but stellar. My personal experience in this stems from me getting my multi-engine rating. Being under the hood is one thing, but actual is an entirely different situation. I trained in a Piper Aztec and was still fast enough and sharp enough to handle instrument flying with my old bad habits while under the hood. I purchased my own Aztec to use for my business, and once I was alone in actual conditions, things drastically changed. One day in particular, I was taking off from Fargo in low visibility, in moderate snow, and low ceilings. What was happening is that I was chasing needles and not flying a good attitude. I was departing Fargo on runway 36 with a takeoff clearance of climb and maintain 4,000 feet. Turn left to a heading of 270. I took off, retracted my landing gear and flaps, then set my RPM and power. My pitch up was a little too high, so my airspeed was not climbing like it should have been. I pushed my nose down, fixating on my airspeed indicator, and found myself no longer climbing. I was close to the ground in a slight descent. I again pitched up, but it was sloppy as I was still chasing my airspeed instead of establishing a pitch for my climb. As I made the turnout, the snow quickly obscured the horizon. I started my left turn and looked down to the left to see that I still had ground contact. The falling snow was mesmerizing. I bet I stared at it for all of 3 seconds before my attention went back to my instrument panel, and I realized when I looked at my attitude indicator that I was in a 45-degree bank. I decreased my bank with my turn coordinator and then looked at my altimeter to find that I was no longer climbing but in another descent. I went back to my airspeed indicator to get back to my best rate of climb, pulled back on the yoke to achieve that, and fixated on the airspeed needle to bring it back into check. Looked at my altimeter to see that I was climbing, but again, too steeply. I checked my heading to find out that I blew past the assigned 270 degrees, so I started to turn back to the right to my assigned heading. I eventually regained control of the situation, but spent a great deal of time after that flight rethinking how I should be flying in these conditions. The first thing I learned was that I could not pay so much attention to the things outside the cockpit during critical phases of flight in IMC conditions. I ended up concluding that I needed to pay more attention to my attitude indicator and what it was telling me. I later discussed this all with the chief pilot I was working for, and he agreed with me wholeheartedly. Another instructor and I were discussing the instrument scan, and his idea was to run around the clock on each and every instrument, and even in lighter aircraft, by the time he got back to the attitude indicator, he was all out of whack and had to start chasing needles. Instrument fixation ensues and your scan is destroyed. My solution was what he called the spoke and hub method. The attitude indicator being the hub, and the spokes leading you to everything else, yet you had to come back to the hub in order to follow the next spoke out. The attitude indicator is the only instrument on your panel that shows both pitch and bank, and does this instantaneously and very accurately. Everything you do can use the attitude indicator to establish the maneuver. Just back it up with the appropriate primary instrument. If you always go back to the attitude indicator, you will always be able to readjust your bank and pitch before you verify it. A great example of this is when I began my sim training for my type rating in the Metro 3. Gross takeoff weight was 14,500 pounds, and the sim instructor made sure that it was always set to that. With 1,000 horsepower on each side, the Metro was a handful to fly, to say the least. On my first flight, I was in the right seat, observing while my classmate flew the first lesson. He had 350 hours in the Metro already flying right seat and was now working on his own type rating as well as his ATP. The instructor told him on takeoff to climb to 10 degrees nose high, and that should establish his climb V speeds. He was from the school of thought of so many other schools that what he was told did not click with him. He immediately began chasing needles, and the flight was sloppy to say the least. After what I had learned about attitude flying, the 10 degrees nose high statement resonated well with me. Being used to using the attitude indicator, I did exactly what he said, and my first flight went very well. My classmate could not figure out how I did so much better than he did with our respective experience levels in the Metro, so I asked him, "Did you hear the instructor tell you to pitch up to 10 degrees on takeoff?" He said no, so we talked more at length on the subject. We got permission to use the sim ourselves after hours, and he showed me the flow of the cockpit, and I taught him how to attitude fly. Now let's discuss a little more about instrument flying theory, and then take an instrument flight in a Cessna 172. Ceilings and visibility are low. I will talk you through my scan slowly at first, speed it up, then in real time without the narration. At times I will not show a scan. See if you can keep up with your own scan. So what exactly are your primary instruments? As you see in this table, your airspeed indicator is primary for power in straight and level flight, pitch in climbs and descents, and turns. The altimeter is primary for pitch in straight and level flight and turns. The turn coordinator is primary for bank in a turn, and the heading indicator primary for bank in every other aspect of a turn. The VSI becomes primary for constant rate climbs and descents, and the power gauge for power. Note here that the attitude indicator is primary for pitch and bank when establishing a climb or descent and starting a turn. For everything else, it is a supporting instrument. Let's review how to read the attitude indicator. The attitude indicator is one of your gyro-driven instruments. There are several different versions of this instrument, but they all have the same principle in common. Most of the variations are very subtle. The attitude indicator is not a required instrument for VFR flight. However, it is incredibly important and is required for IFR flight. In other videos, I teach more about the inner workings of this instrument as well as its practical use. But for now, let's just stick to the basics and learn how to read it. The attitude indicator, otherwise known as the artificial horizon, is the one single instrument on your aircraft that not only shows both pitch and bank information, but does this instantaneously and very accurately. With the traditional round gauge, or steam gauge as we call it, this instrument will be a gyro-driven instrument. It may be powered by DC electric or AC electric by using an inverter, but typically, especially in training aircraft, this instrument is vacuum or pressure driven. In a glass cockpit, the attitude indicator is electronically driven. These newer versions of the attitude indicator are very reliable and not prone to tumbling. Let's begin with discussing what all attitude indicators have in common. Most attitude indicators will have pitch references that will be numbered for you. They will also have bank indications in increments of 10, 20, and 30 degree increments, as well as 45, 60, and 90. Every indicator will have some representation of the horizon, typically separating a blue sky and a brown or black earth. Each indicator has a representation of your aircraft in some manner that will help you to visualize your relative attitude. Your best friend for pitch is the center point of that airplane representation. No matter what angle of bank you have, the center dot of that representation or the tip of the delta-shaped representation will define your pitch. This is important whether you are trying to maintain your altitude in a turn or your pitch in a climb or descent. The pointer on the top of the indicator will precisely display your bank angle as defined by the various bank indicating lines. Some indicators have what is commonly known as a sky pointer. This simply means that the pointer will always point towards the sky. This can be a little confusing when you first start to use one, as it seems backwards from the traditional pointer. If you ever run across one of these, just remember to use the airplane representation for your bank and only pay attention to that pointer for the precision of your bank angle once you are established. A glass cockpit, or AHRS, attitude, heading, and reference system will have the attitude indicator as the background in the entire window, but will read the same way as the older steam gauge. The more sophisticated indicators will have additional instruments, such as a flight director overlaid on the representation, and you can see this in many forms, but that will be a discussion for another time. This is your standard T on the instrument panel. These instruments are the most important and most used instruments in your scan. I mentioned earlier the hub and spoke concept for your scan. This is my preferred method. Think of the attitude indicator as the hub, and every other instrument is connected by the spokes. Every time you scan another instrument, you must go back to the hub or the attitude indicator in order to follow a spoke to another instrument. The key is to know what instrument to scan for the phase of flight you are in at the moment. One of the keys to instrument flying is to not fixate on any one instrument. Once you start to fixate, everything else tends to get out of control. You must, however, spend enough time on a given instrument to read what it says and how it is trending. With experience, this process will become faster and more like second nature. During a climb, besides your attitude indicator, the instruments you most want to focus on are your airspeed indicator for your climb rate, your altimeter for verification of your climb, and your heading indicator to make certain you are not turning. In a climbing turn, you must add the rate of turn indicator and also verify your turn with the heading indicator. While leveling off, you are looking at airspeed, altitude, and heading. Cruise flight is primarily going to be heading and altitude. You still need to verify your other instruments in all of these phases of flight, but the instruments you are not needing to focus on so much can be added in once maybe every 4 or so scans. Airspeed, for instance, in cruise flight should remain constant as long as you are in level flight and the power is not changed. After all, you can hear if the engine is speeding up or slowing down. In the absence of any major change, your airspeed should remain constant. You will also learn how to add instruments such as engine and navigation. Nothing can be left out or taken for granted, but you need to focus on the main thing, and that is flying the airplane. I will cover this more as we take flight. Departing Fargo on runway 36, all instruments are set and we are going to depart straight out on runway heading. Then upon reaching 500 feet, we will turn right to a heading of 090 degrees. Airspeed is alive. "60 knots, rotate 10 degrees nose high." What you will find here is that the best rate of climb for any airplane can be achieved initially by your pitch. Blasting off out of Fargo, which is at 900 feet in this particular airplane for instance, pitching up to 10 degrees will bring your airspeed for your best rate of climb, which is 76 knots. Higher altitude airports will require less of a pitch, but to start, 10 degrees is a nice benchmark. Establish the 10 degrees nose high, then verify the results with the airspeed indicator, which in this case would be the primary instrument for pitch. Watch the airspeed indicator after we pitch up. It takes some time for the airplane to catch up to that 76 knots, but our pitch can remain constant at 10 degrees up, ensuring a good climb out while the airplane accelerates. The airspeed will settle right into 76 knots, give or take a few, without fixating on the airspeed and chasing the needle. Remember, it takes time for objects to speed up and slow down. The heavier the object, the more time it takes. Using your pitch to get to your desired airspeed also allows you to observe your bank attitude, which will allow you to keep your heading more accurately. Do not get too caught up in what you see out the window, as it can distract you from flying the airplane. Once you have cleared the runway, focus on the instruments, not the ever-changing scenery outside. Once you have reached 500 feet AGL and have your airplane cleaned up, start your right turn to 090 degrees. While instrument flying, you should make your turns at a maximum of standard rate. In other words, 3 degrees per second, or a 2-minute turn, meaning it will take you 2 minutes to turn 360 degrees. This turn can be verified with the rate of turn indicator, in this case by placing the wing of the airplane on the lower hash mark. Once again, you can initialize this with the attitude indicator. So what angle of bank will determine a standard rate turn? Well, that all depends on your airspeed. The best and easiest rule of thumb I have been able to come up with is, take your indicated airspeed in knots, drop the last digit, and add 6 to that number. In other words, right now you have an indicated airspeed of 85 knots. 85 Drop the 5, leaves you with the number 8. Add 6 to that, and 8 plus 6 equals 14. So a 14-degree bank will put you in a standard rate turn. Verify this with your rate of turn indicator. Back to your attitude indicator, and you can keep both your pitch for your climb and your bank for your standard rate turn. You will also want to go down and check that heading indicator to make certain that it is turning in the correct direction. Remember, when you have an attitude indicator like this one, that dot in the middle of the airplane wing representation will always show your pitch attitude regardless of your bank. 10 degrees or so from your intended heading, simply use your attitude indicator to begin a rollout, guided by the rate of turn and heading of your heading indicator. If you can match your rollout on the attitude indicator with the speed in which your heading indicator is turning, you will do well. When you are on your attitude indicator, keep the pitch that has kept your climb constant. Your altimeter is only at 2,400 feet, so you have a long way to go up to 4,000 feet, meaning the altimeter does not have to be checked so much at this point, nor does your airspeed, as everything should be stabilized. Your main focus for these few moments can be your attitude and your heading. I mentioned before that the attitude indicator is the only instrument that shows both pitch and bank, and does this very accurately and instantaneously. Notice how the VSI jumps about while the altimeter remains in a fairly constant climb in the turbulence. Notice how the rate of turn indicator bounces around a bit while the heading remains constant. The attitude indicator is also moving around a bit due to the turbulence, but it is showing pitch and bank changes instantly, which can be accurately corrected with control inputs. Remember to not over-control in these situations. Unless you encounter a violent updraft or something that really messes with your attitude, slow, small control inputs will get the corrections done and make for a much smoother ride. On the level off, simply use your trim to pitch the airplane to a zero pitch angle. Here you will need to pay much more attention to the altimeter, not only to catch your target altitude, but to see the trend. Is the needle still moving? Am I climbing or am I descending? In this type of aircraft, always trim your pitch down before you reduce power. It will level you off faster and more accurately, and save you from having to keep readjusting your power and trim continuously for the next several minutes. Trim for your anticipated cruise airspeed, then bring your power back to your anticipated cruise setting. Use all of your senses while flying in any conditions. This airplane is a Cessna 172 and has a fixed pitch prop. As the aircraft levels off and increases in speed, so will the engine RPM as the resistance on the propeller decreases. When you hear the engine begin to race, you can figure out that you are reaching your cruise speed and can bring the power back to your desired cruise power setting. In this demonstration, we will use 2,450 RPM. Besides the sometimes overwhelming urge to fixate on a single instrument while chasing needles such as airspeed, I see fixation on other items such as turning a heading bug, the OBS, or as in this case, setting your power. The tendency is to fixate on the power gauge while you tweak it and ignore the other instruments. Don't do that. Instead, you know where your power lever is. Reach for it and smoothly reduce it while you are watching the attitude indicator and the other primary instruments. When you hear what you think may be your desired power setting, glance down at the tack and see if it is, then head right back to the attitude indicator. If your setting is not where you want it, use the same method to tweak the power and glance at it again. Fixating on the tack could find you off heading and off altitude very quickly. Once you are in cruise flight, make sure that the wing representation on your attitude indicator is right on the horizon in your line of sight. This will help you maintain accuracy. Normally, once this is set, it will not have to be set again, but always pay attention if it gets bumped off. Once you are in cruise, you can perform your cruise checklist items, such as set your mixture if applicable. I always take time to check engine instruments during cruise when not so much is happening. My scan for this phase of flight looks like this. Attitude indicator, verify pitch, bank, and bank. Altimeter, verify altitude and no movement. Attitude indicator, verify pitch, bank, and bank. Heading indicator, verify heading and no movement. Attitude indicator, verify pitch, bank, and bank. Engine instruments in green. Attitude indicator, verify pitch, bank, and bank. That scan will continue on indefinitely to make certain that you stay on altitude, stay on heading, and everything else is in sync. Now we will make a left turn to a heading of 360 degrees. Once again, your bank angle to establish for your standard rate turn can be calculated using your indicated airspeed. We currently show an indicated airspeed of 110 knots. Take that number, drop the last digit, add 6, and you come up with the number 17. So a 17-degree bank should put you right on the money. Establish your turn by smoothly rolling into that 17-degree bank while keeping your pitch level so you do not climb or descend. Once your turn is established, you will need to verify your other instruments. Check the rate and direction of turn with the turn coordinator. Here you can also verify that you are in coordinated flight. Back to the attitude indicator to verify your pitch and bank. Over to your altimeter to verify that your altitude is where it should be with no movement. Back to the attitude indicator, then check your heading indicator to ensure that you are indeed turning in the correct direction. Then back to the attitude indicator again. Keep this scan going throughout the turn, mostly focusing on your attitude and maintaining altitude. In the standard rate turn, it is going to take you 30 seconds to turn the 90 degrees. So for the first few scans after your turn is verified, you do not need to pay too much attention to the heading. Here, if you have a heading bug and have not yet changed it to your newly assigned heading, go ahead and change it. Remember, locate the knob to change the heading and turn it without fixating on the bug. When you have turned it some, scan the instrument and see where it is and make any necessary adjustments. When your heading is close to being on that heading of north, you will need to pay much more attention to the heading indicator so you can roll out appropriately. Lead your roll by approximately the same number of degrees of heading that you have for a bank. In other words, we are currently at 17 degrees bank, so about 15 degrees off of our heading, start your rollout. This will help you to have a smooth transition. Again, roll out using your attitude indicator and ensure that your pitch remains level. Now you can resume your scan for cruise flight. Now let's look at a descent. If you are looking for a 500 foot per minute descent in this type of aircraft, typically you can reduce the power by 300 RPM and just let the nose come down. Considering the relationship between pitch and power, we are still trimmed for a pitch that puts us at 110 knots indicated. So the reduction in power should put you very close to that 500 foot per minute descent. Tendencies are to tense up and pull back on the yoke or push forward too much. Pulling on the yoke will only slow you down without a descent, and pushing forward too much will put you in a steeper dive. Once again, do not fixate on your tack. Smoothly pull some power out. Listen to the reduction of RPM of your engine. Scan your tack, and then make any adjustments needed while keeping your scan going. Establish your descent with your attitude indicator by putting the wing representation just below the white horizon line. Most of these planes I have found will set up the perfect descent by lining the very top of the wing representation directly under the white horizon line or slightly touching it. Here you are also ensuring your bank. Verify your descent with your altimeter in that it is moving in the correct direction. Back to your attitude to verify pitch and bank. Then your rate of descent with your VSI. Back to your attitude indicator, then verify that you are still at that 110 knots indicated. You will also want to go down and check that heading indicator to make certain that it is turning in the correct direction. Back to your attitude indicator, Verify this with your rate of turn indicator. To level off, simply add the power back to your 2450 RPM or whatever you had in cruise, and you will be right back on track. So let's put what we have learned into practical use and shoot an ILS. I programmed the GPS for the ILS 36 into Fargo.
172 Sierra Papa Fargo approach, 5 miles from Opti. Turn right heading 330 degrees. Maintain 3,000 feet until established on a published segment of the approach. Cleared ILS runway 36.
330, 3000 until established, cleared ILS 36 to Sierra Papa. Again, when you chase instruments and not get established on the attitude indicator, things can get out of sync in a hurry. Get back to the attitude indicator, fix whatever is broken, and verify it with the other primary instruments. Our clearance has put us at 3,000 feet, so let's reduce the power and get down there. Localizer is alive.
Cessna 2 Sierra Papa, contact tower 133.8.
Over to tower 2 Sierra Papa. Fargo Tower, Cessna 172 Sierra Papa on the ILS 36.
Cessna 172 Sierra Papa, cleared to land runway 36.
Clear to land 36 to Sierra Papa. Remember that flying a good course is as much about determining and maintaining your heading as much as it is following the CDI. Glide slope is alive. Reduce power to 1900 RPM and add your first notch of flaps. Begin your descent. Notice as the localizer CDI or the glide slope CDI gets off a bit, I make very subtle, very small corrections, all using the attitude indicator. Stabilized approach. Power is left alone, but I check the airspeed before I pull back on the yoke a little to keep my glide slope. With the instantaneous response from the attitude indicator, I can keep my corrections minimal, and I will not be chasing needles. .500 feet. Second notch of flaps in. This balloons us up a little bit, and I will need to re-intercept the glide slope. Minimums. With the missed approach point met and no runway in sight, we would normally start a missed approach procedure here. But since we are in a simulator, let's keep going down to see what we can see. down to 50 feet with no runway in sight. So let's go missed approach. Full power, pitch to climb attitude, 1 notch of flaps out, regain airspeed, then flaps up. Again, keep in mind that this video was done flying a Cessna 172, a light airplane with an approach speed of around 90 knots. I chose this aircraft because it is a training aircraft that is familiar with most pilots, and the slow speeds give me a chance to teach on this subject mostly in real time. If and when you transition into heavier, faster equipment, attitude flying becomes all that much more important. Learning how to use your attitude indicator properly and not omitting it from your scan is really the key to a long and safe flying career. All of your maneuvers will follow these basic principles. If you can maintain your pitch for your desired airspeed and bank for a standard rate turn or level flight, you are walking on sunshine. All of your primary instruments will fall right into place with a proper attitude.